Whew, it's hot today. Have you heard about the wet bulb temperature? If you haven't, you will more and more going forward. It's a way to measure outdoor temperature when the thermometer is covered with a wet cloth to simulate the cooling capacity of the human body by sweating. It produces a number much lower than the temperature outside based on humidity and such, but the thing about it is that if the wet bulb temperature goes above 32 degrees or 90 degrees American, a human being can't go outside. At 35 degrees, even with unlimited water, fans, everything, you'll die within hours if you're not in an air-conditioned area. Remember the heat wave last month? Well, during it, a city in Pakistan, Jacobabad, passed that temperature. And here in Canada, we experienced the hottest temperature ever recorded in the country's history, and it was not far away from that number. And this is just the beginning. Large parts of the world are going to just become unlivable. I think I'm going to need something to help with the morale on this video. I think it's pretty much a no-brainer unless you're rich or dumb enough to believe what rich people lie to you with, that this world is becoming a place less hospitable to human life. Well, all life for that matter. We're sitting at the beginning of a mass extinction event like the apex of some roller coaster to hell. That means life will change for us quite a bit over the next few decades on the only planet in the universe we know of that we can live on. And one aspect of these changes is that people will start to leave large portions of the world as they become uninhabitable. Billions of people could need to move as the oceans or heat consume their lands, creating a refugee crisis unlike any seen before in human history. And it might already be beginning. Experts have argued that some of our contemporary refugee crises are climate-induced. So how we look at and talk about refugees right now is very important. How we treat refugees will shape how we approach the next few decades. In my estimation, it'll define the latter 21st century. So let's talk about refugees, past, present, and future, and what we can do about this crisis before it really takes off. There's no real natural way to transition from that one gracefully, so let's take a second before we dive in and talk about today's sponsor, Bokksu. Hello friends, it's your authentic influencer friend, Tristan here, for Bokksu. As you know, the Tokyo Olympics are almost here, and what says watching sports more than snacks? Bokksu's a snack box subscription service that delivers snacks straight from Japan to your door. So while you watch Michael Phelps take the gold in baseball, you can enjoy delicious treats that not only taste good, but also honor Japanese heritage. Get it? Because it's Tokyo. They even work with artisanal makers to make them as authentic an experience as possible. I give that policy a gold medal from me. But for you Yankees who are ready to see America dominate in the handball event, have I got news for you. Bokksu now offers free shipping to the United States. First-time Bokksu customers will receive the Seasons of Japan box, so they can get a taste of each snack for different seasons. I give that box a gold medal from me. Repeated customers will get a theme box every month, like this one, which is Tropical Travels. What I always like is that every box comes with a good variety. I'm actually not a dessert fiend, I don't have that much of a sweet tooth, so the savory options really call to me, as well as the tea included in each box. Once you opt Javelin to this deal, you'll never want to hammer throw it away. Use my code StepBackHistory20 to get 20% off your first Japanese snack box from Bokksu. Take advantage of this limited time offer. Sports! I would like to issue an apology. Hi, I'm Tristan, and this is Step Back. If you like this video, please subscribe for what has been best described by Professor Zobarelephant on Reddit as both enlightening and depressing. I guess we should start with the long history of refugees. As long as there have been wars and disasters, there have been people displaced by them. The oldest forerunner to what you might call a legal structure for refugees comes from the tradition of sanctuary. We've known that places of refuge have been a tradition going back as far as antiquity in ancient Greece, but still, anthropologists suspect that it's a much older one that derives from essential human altruism. It shows up in almost all religions around the world, and can be found in places as far as the Middle East to pre-Columbian North America. The duty to take in and protect those who are fleeing oppression seems to be universal. Today, many aspects of national cultures have refugees moving there to thank for it, like the exile of French Protestants or Huguenots to neighboring countries, or the fleeing Jews from Russian pogroms. But formalized laws on the rights of refugees wouldn't become a thing on paper until the early days of the League of Nations in the wake of the Russian Revolution. The League of Nations was a sort of forerunner to the UN. They began a High Commission of Refugees in 1921, primarily to deal with over 1 million Russians displaced by the Russian Civil War and Lenin's revoking of citizenship for Russian expats. Soon, the next crisis would come with the fallout of the Armenian genocide in the former Ottoman Empire. More on that one here. Furthermore, Greece and Turkey organized a massive swap of people as each country ethnically cleansed people from the other ethnic group from their countries. But already, we saw hints of the problems to come. In response, the United States passed 2 anti-immigration laws specifically to prevent these people from escaping to America, especially Jews, Slavs, and Italians. Freedophobia was still a thing back then. The League of Nations refugee program would then fall apart due to the same thing that took down the whole League of Nations, not dealing with the rise of Nazi Germany. The brazen oppression of Jews during the Nazi regime led to a mass of refugees leaving Germany. World War II itself caused the largest refugee crisis in history, as millions worldwide found themselves displaced by the war, rivaled only by the partition of India. Dealing with displaced persons, or DPs as they called them, was one of the most critical projects of the baby United Nations in the wake of the war. After it, there was a mass ethnic cleansing campaign of Germans living throughout Eastern Europe, and colossal population transfers between the Soviet Union and Poland. In 1951, the UN held a major convention on the status of refugees, outlining international law on their rights. Drafted in the convention articles, we have rules on what is a refugee, what their rights are in any state they settle in, and prohibitions on their discrimination. A refugee, by this definition, was a person who, quote,
owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence as a result of such events, is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to it.
This definition has been reworked a few times, most recently in 2011 by the UN Human Rights Commission, as people who are
outside their country of nationality or habitual residence and unable to return there, owing to serious and indiscriminate threats to life, physical integrity, or freedom, resulting from generalized violence or events seriously disturbing public order.
This one is a little more solid in defining the climate refugee, as major disasters and uninhabitable temperatures definitely count as indiscriminate threats to life. The rights of the refugee is a little long, but it essentially says states are obligated by international law to take in refugees, provide them with the basics of life, including education, and not discriminate against them. But those rules don't get applied super great. For example, tons of Palestinian refugees have been living in camps for going on 70 years. The UN has said they have the right to return home, but the US and Israel said, nah, and the latter has been illegally occupying their land ever since. During the Syrian civil war, over 60% of the population have been displaced. It prompted the ugliest racism I had seen to that point in my life in places like Europe and the United States. Furthermore, an anti-Muslim genocide in Myanmar created a huge refugee crisis for the Rohingya Muslim population, prompting angry backlashes in the countries they settled. This is, though, just the tip of the iceberg, and refugees from many countries are looking for new homes all the time. more and more each year as a fact. And I hate that I'm going to say this, nearly half of all refugees are children. The dangers of the conflict they escaped, the harsh conditions put on them, and discrimination in their host countries lead to long-term psychological scars. Schools are often unprepared and lack resources needed to help these children deal with major educational disruptions and the fallout of some severe psychological trauma. Many are also, not surprisingly, separated from family, with many being orphans. And that's the milder of the problems. Refugee children are often targeted for abuse and exploitation in their host countries. They're often victims of child labor, human trafficking, camp diseases like malaria, and recruitment into terrorist organizations or as child soldiers. And the response from the West to these poor, desperate people, nearly half children fleeing for their lives? Well, let's just say Viktor Orban, the dictator of Hungary, invoked the phrase Fortress Europa, an old World War II term, to outline a need to militarize the continent's borders. As a result, during the Syrian refugee crisis, the treatment of those fleeing was abysmal. Countries fenced off their entire borders as people wandered looking for a host country. People actively went out into the Mediterranean Sea to intercept refugees crossing in overcrowded, unsafe boats, their only hope that they might be one of the people who escaped the war. And in the US, children and parents were brutally separated at the southern border in what could only be called concentration camps. Camps that Joe Biden has still yet to close, by the way. Under Trump, the US admitted far fewer refugees than the US had in decades. These people, looking for anywhere to survive, were scrutinized for what they could provide for their host countries, when we're dealing with people literally escaping the shelling of their homes. I deal with a lot of emotional stuff working on this channel, and being a person out in the world in, general. The treatment of refugees is one of those things that still, after all this time, really gets under my skin. I can feel this sad, dark mass in my throat bubble up when I think about those kids in camps. I think I'm gonna need a second. This is the reaction only now. The modern refugee population is not even close to where it's going to be. Every year, the number of people displaced is going up. The whole point of this video is to remind us of the importance of refugee policy as climate change makes these numbers explode. The backlash already on display has some very dark places it can go, and I'd like it very much if we could avoid those, please. So now, I'm going to talk about just how bad it could get. The coming climate catastrophe is going to be bad. This doesn't get the most coverage, but climate change researchers experience mental stress and see therapists for climate grief. Seeing how bad things are getting and the complete lack of action puts them through the mental equivalent of mourning the coming death of the planet. I don't know if I need to linger on this, as I don't imagine many climate change deniers got this far, but still, desertification, increased tropical storms, food shortages, runaway methane seeping from the permafrost, floods, droughts, and as we're seeing now, wildfires and deadly heat waves. I mean, it's a bit on the nose that Lytton, British Columbia recorded the highest temperature in Canadian history, right before wildfires scrubbed it from the face of the earth. Natural disasters are going to be more common, and rising sea levels plus desertification will create a lot of refugees. Experts suspect that as many as 1.2 billion, with a B, people could be displaced by the effects of climate change by 2050, which is around the time I'll be 62 years old. The largest refugee crisis in human history, World War II, was at the highest estimates about 20 million people. This coming crisis will be something unseen before in human history. That's 1 in 8 people as refugees. And if we let the trend of backlash fester, we could see this crisis create some of the ugliest moments in history. The right is excruciatingly, slowly coming around to acknowledging the existence of climate change. And as many of us expected, it's terrifying. The response seems to be what I'll call fortress politics. The growing swell of displaced people will result in a doubling down on nationalism, militarized borders, and violent defense of natural resources for a small, wealthy elite. If you want to see a preview, look at the massive inequalities in COVID vaccination. Rich countries are vaccinating their populations at the expense of much of the world. And much like COVID, our insistence on using nationalism to justify hoarding our resources will come to bite us in the ass when new and deadlier mutations arise in the vast majority of the world we abandon to their fates. Maybe our hope for climate salvation can be seen in places like Venezuela. Just this month, Cuba has started sharing vaccines to save the Venezuelan people against US-led economic sanctions meant to stop vaccine shipments. As things continue to deteriorate, fortress politics could radicalize further into full-on ecofascism. It's an ideology with roots in Nazi Germany and includes elements of using fascism to enact environmental protections. But like all fascist movements, it uses provably untrue assumptions to push its real agenda: racial supremacy and genocide. We see these ideas already taking hold in extremist circles. The Christchurch shooter is an eco-fascist. His manifesto was shared widely on fascist spaces like 8chan. Even some people with assumedly progressive values spout eco-fascist talking points, like blaming climate change on the developing world or overpopulation. They blame the people who have contributed the least to the climate emergency. At the same time, the wealthiest 10% of the planet produces half of the world's emissions. Climate change won't be addressed by eugenics and population control. Capitalism and inequality are the problems. But fascism, no matter the form, has never really been about the facts. Eco-fascism is like all other forms of fascism, congealing around a set of lies to dismantle democracy, install a brutal hierarchical state, and commit mass murder. God damn, this video was dark, even by step back standards. So, let me prevent catastrophizing by saying that this is just extrapolating from a limited data set. In many ways, I'm outlining the worst case scenario. There is a right way to respond: socialism. But you already know this. Even you sad globe emoji Twitter people must be seeing the writing on the wall by now. I went to such dark places today because I want to make the case that the way we talk about refugees and the politics around asylum and displaced people is critical. It's going to be the defining political issue of this century. And if we must insist on running the world by giving unlimited power to a handful of reptiles, then we must push and prod those reptiles to know we care about this issue. This is not a time to wallow in despair in an effort to check out, instead of showing up for the work that needs to be done. Instead, we must stand and fight for the refugees. The future will see a lot of people lose their homes, possibly even you, and we must never forget one fact about the displaced through all of the fear and propaganda and violence and politics. These are human beings. We all are. And if we forget that all of us are in this together, then our species is truly lost.